The Best of Everything by Rona Jaffe, Chapter 2. New York is a city of constant architectural change, buildings being torn down, new ones being put up in their places, streets being torn up, fenced off, signs proclaiming politely, "Sorry, we are making way for a growing New York." Its inhabitants, more likely than not, live in recently converted houses, converted brownstones, converted whitestones, converted rococo mansions, all partitioned off into 2- and 3-room apartments, and what is euphemistically called the 1.5. April Morrison, waking up in her new apartment at 7 o'clock on a Thursday morning in January, lived in a 1.5. Her apartment building was a converted tenement, just north of Columbus Circle. It was a walk-up apartment, 3 stories above what the landlord called a winter garden, which was really a kind of small enclosed courtyard with metal chairs piled upside down on one another and going to rust, and a patch of dirt where someone might someday plant flowers. It consisted of one large room with a kitchen that was in a closet and a bed that came out of the wall and had an uncoiled spring that made her sleep in a fetal position. The uncoiled spring did not bother her sleep particularly, however, because April was an extremely relaxed and healthy girl. There was also a bathroom in this apartment, with a makeshift shower in the bathtub and a fair-sized closet. On this morning, the moment her alarm clock went off, April was out of bed and standing on her feet. The day before had been the first day of her first job in New York, and excited as she was, she had forgotten to set her alarm and had gotten to the office at noon. It wasn't going to happen again. Heating water for her instant coffee in a pot from the 5 and 10, April sang a little song she hadn't remembered in years. It was a song she had learned in Sunday school. Her 2 older sisters back home in Springs had both been Sunday school teachers before their early marriages, and when April had announced that she wanted to go to dramatic school instead, they had laughed. After all, there were thousands of pretty girls with long gold hair who wanted to go to Hollywood, they had told her, and even though she'd always had the lead in the high school plays, if she had any sense, she would forget that nonsense in a hurry. Why? Her father had said. Why shouldn't April be an actress? But fathers always thought their youngest daughters were rather special. In junior college, she had studied speech, ballet, and singing, and, to appease the family, typing and shorthand. For a graduation present, her parents gave her a train ticket to New York and $500. She was to stay in New York for as long as the money lasted and do as she pleased, go to the theater, sightsee, go to museums, look up a high school classmate of her mother's who had married a man from Brooklyn and had gone there to live. April arrived just after Thanksgiving and did all these things for 3 days. On the 4th day, she read in the newspaper of a chorus call for girl dancers for a new musical. She went to it, with mingled hope and terror, had her turn with what seemed like at least 500 other girls, and was told politely that she would hear. She never heard anything. At the end of the 2nd week she had been in New York, she answered a call for girl singers. Most of the singers were quite unattractive, she noticed with private hope. They seemed much less pretty than the dancers had been. Why were the singers in shows never as pretty as the dancers? She discovered why very soon. With their trained voices, these girls did not have to be pretty, you could listen to them and you didn't have to look too closely. With her semi-trained voice, church choir, and the 2 years at junior college, April didn't stand a chance. She was thanked for coming and told politely that she would hear. The next day, she went to a chorus call at the Copacabana. At least she could walk straight. When she got to the Copa, she felt like a midget. All the girls were 6 feet tall, or at least they looked that large to her. April was 5'3" in her bare feet. They didn't even ask her to show her legs, for which she was just as glad, because she decided at the last minute that she would never be able to explain it at home if she became a showgirl. Her parents thought all nightclub chorus girls were kept women on the side. What should she do? The $500 was not lasting as long as she had thought it would. There was that handsome cab ride. Who would have thought it would be so expensive? And having a facial, and that bottle of perfume she couldn't help buying, and then all those taxis. She had a feeling the taxi drivers took her on a longer route than was absolutely necessary. She knew one thing, though. She was going to take the subway and eat at the automat and stay in New York if it meant being a sales clerk at the 5 and 10. The hotel was too expensive, so she found this small apartment. How she loved New York. She had never seen anything like it in her entire life. It wasn't as if she would die if she couldn't become an actress. Back home in Springs, being an actress had seemed both glamorous and obtainable because it had been part of a dream world. She had read all the plays of Eugene O'Neill and J.M. Barrie and Kaufman and Hart, and she had said the lines aloud in the privacy of her own room. That didn't give her any more right to be a successful actress, she realized, than cutting out recipes gave one a right to be a chef at the Waldorf. Being an actress had been part of a fantasy, a picture, which had included tall buildings in the blue twilight and the fountain in front of the plaza, seeing Marlene Dietrich buying handkerchiefs at Bonwitz, and Frank Sinatra coming out of Lindy's, and beautiful women no one had ever heard of wearing white mink and diamonds, and being escorted by handsome older men. The body of the fantasy was true. She was walking in it and looking at it breathlessly. And the actress part of it? She hadn't realized until she had actually been walking past those tall buildings in the blue twilight how insignificant she really was. Where could she ever begin to attack a fortress like New York? She didn't even want to. She only wanted to stay there until she herself was part of it, one of those well-groomed, well-attended women, and she half realized that was a fantasy too. She only had to walk up the 3 flights to her dingy room to know what a fantasy it was. Nevertheless, she was very happy, and every moment brought something new and exciting. Nobody else back home had been rejected in person by Mr. George Abbott. An employment agency ad in the New York Times interested her. She went to the agency and was sent to Fabian Publications. She had wanted one of the $90 a week jobs, but this was her first, and she was told to take it and be glad for the experience. Everyone at home had read My Secret Life avidly in high school. She herself had outgrown it only 3 years before. To tell the truth, she was quite thrilled to be working at the very source of a magazine which had helped build up much of her present misinformation. Her grandmother read The Cross, too. She wrote home about her new job immediately, and also broke the news that she was not coming back, at least not for a long time. She drank her coffee standing up and dressed hastily. Here it was 8:30, and she had been daydreaming again. As she emerged into the street, she caught sight of her reflection in the window of a delicatessen next door to her apartment house. Her coat was too short, or was it? She remembered the girl in the tweed suit with the raccoon collar who had been working at the desk next to hers yesterday afternoon at Fabian. What a sophisticated-looking girl. Something about her looked right. Was it the leather gloves? Perhaps white cotton gloves looked terrible in January. They were her best gloves, and so she had never given them a second thought. She looked down at them and noticed for the first time the hole in the finger. She pulled them off and stuffed them into her purse and walked quickly to the subway. She was still rather frightened of the subway and never could bring herself to run for a train the way the other people did, for fear one of the huge doors would close on her and leave her half in and half out, screaming as the car bore her away to a mysterious and horrible death in the darkness of the tunnel. She watched the people scurrying and pushing one another as the sound of an approaching train grew louder, and she delayed for a moment in front of the change booth, counting out her money for a token. "Good morning," she said pleasantly to the man behind the bars. He was one of the few people in New York whom she had seen more than once, and this gave her a rather friendly feeling toward him. She always said good morning to him. It made her feel less lonely. "How are you today?" "Just fine," she said. She fished up her token and turned to leave. "Wait a minute," he whispered. He looked around and took hold of her wrist with fingers that were surprisingly strong. "I got something to show you." "To show me?" "Look," he said. He slid a photograph, picture side down, through the change door. She looked at him curiously and picked it up. At first, she didn't realize what it was. It seemed like two people in a strained and unaccustomed posture, wrestlers, perhaps. Then she saw it was a man and a woman, and when she discovered what they were doing to each other, she felt her face redden, and her hand began to shake so hard she could scarcely push the picture back through the slot. She turned to flee. "Hey!" he called after her, and then more loudly, indignantly, "Hey!" She looked back for one instant. "What's the matter?" he called. "I thought we was friends. Ha 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 ha." He laughed raucously, angrily, insulted and wanting to hurt her. "Where you going?" She pushed her way through the turnstile, and for the first time in her life, jumped aboard a subway train the instant its doors started to close. A fat man took her arm to help her as the rubber-tipped jaws snapped shut. "What's your hurry?" he said. "You'll get yourself killed someday. Crazy New York girls." New York girls, she thought, and her fright began to slip away from her. He thought she was a New York girl. Did that mean she looked as if she belonged? Perhaps that terrible man in the change booth had thought she was a native New Yorker too, and hadn't realized that back home you spoke to everybody and it didn't mean a thing. She pushed her way to a seat, edging her way between two men who were dashing for it. She received a sharp elbow in the ribs, achieved the seat triumphantly, and when she saw her two competitors collide into each other, she could barely keep back her smile. She was groping, but she was going to get along. Today in the office, she was going to speak to that smart-looking girl in the raccoon collar. Maybe they could even have lunch together someday. At her desk, she was busy typing addresses on stickers for rejected manuscripts and looking around for Caroline when Miss Farrow came out of her office and headed for her. April was secretly fascinated by Miss Farrow. She wondered whether she had ever been married and what kind of men she saw outside the office. "You'll have to go in and help Mr. Shalimar today," Miss Farrow said, without even a good morning. "His secretary is out sick. It's that large office over there with the closed door. You can give the rest of those stickers to the manuscript clerk to finish." "Yes, ma'am," April said, trying to conceal her delight with a mask of office dignity. She swept all the stickers together and nearly ran down the hall to the room where manuscripts were registered and handed out to readers. Mr. Shalimar was the editor-in-chief of Darby Books. She had only glimpsed him through his half-opened door, a tall, older man with a grayish face and strongly hewn features, and she had never thought she would be lucky enough to meet him. Mary Agnes had told her that Mr. Shalimar had known Eugene O'Neill. "I can't help you with any more of these today," she told the manuscript girl excitedly. "I'm working for Mr. Shalimar." The manuscript clerk stood there impassively in her book-lined room and snapped her chewing gum. "We all have our troubles," she said finally. April looked at her, surprised, and then shrugged and hurried down the hall to the office with the closed door. She tapped on it timidly. There was no answer. She stood for a moment with her ear against the door, trying to hear if there was a conference going on inside, but she heard nothing, so she turned the knob and went in. It was a huge, plush office with a soft, thick carpet on the floor, a black leather sofa, and rows of bookcases lined with paperback books. In front of the wall of windows was a great wooden desk. The blinds were closed against the early morning sunlight. In the desk chair, with his feet crossed on the blotter and his chin on his chest, was Mr. Shalimar, snoring gently. She stood in the doorway, not knowing what to do. Mr. Shalimar snorted in his sleep, tossed his head furiously like a dog shaking itself, and woke up. What? What? He said. He lowered his feet from the desk, swiveled around in his chair, and pulled the cord of the Venetian blinds, flooding the office with light. I'm sorry I disturbed you, she said timidly. Oh, I take a rest now and then, for a minute. He looked at her more closely. Come over here. She stood in front of his enormous desk, feeling as if she were being interviewed all over again. New here, aren't you? She nodded. What's your name? April Morrison. He interlocked his fingers on the desk in front of him. Do you know that for this job you have, we turned away 15 other girls? No, sir. What do you want to do? Get married? Be an editor? I don't know yet. His brows drew together. What makes you think you have more of a right to be here than any of those 15 other girls? She put her hands behind her back so he would not see them trembling. I don't know, sir, she said. I haven't met them. What makes you think you ought to be here instead of, say, a salesgirl in a dress shop? At that moment, she would much rather have been a salesgirl in a dress shop, but she said bravely, I don't think I'd be a very good salesgirl. Why not? Because I'm not interested in it. And you're interested in books? Yes. He leaned back, put his hands behind his head, and laughed. For a moment, she thought he was laughing at her, and her eyes filled with angry tears. Don't mind, he said. I always ask the same question of every new girl. I like to see how they think. You'd be surprised at the wacky answers some of them give me. Well, April said. She was so relieved she couldn't help smiling. I hope I didn't give you a wacky answer. Not at all, he said. You're sensible as well as pretty. His compliment made her feel more at ease. Anyway, I don't think it was fair, she said. After all, I'm only a typist here. Is that your ambition? No, I really wanted to be an actress. Like to read plays. Very much. He leaned on the desk, and a faraway look came over his face. I used to say to Eugene O'Neill, I knew him well, you know. In the old days, that is. Before he was famous, he was a protégé of mine. You don't seem old enough. But he had respect for my opinion. I used to encourage him. He smiled at her. I'll tell you some stories someday. I was considered quite a boy genius as an editor, you know. That's before your time. My goodness, April said. I'd love to hear them. Sometime when we have more time, he said gently. I have a load of work to do today. How are you fixed for this afternoon? Could you stay till 6 o'clock if we have to? My girl is sick just when I was going to do the monthly report on all our books. Could you stay? I'd be glad to. If it runs any later than 6, I'll give you money for dinner. All right? All right. Now, shut my door, will you please, and turn the key. There's one thing you'll have to learn right away, and that's how to keep the pests out. I'm keeping the pests out of Mr. Shalimar's private office, she thought, and it seemed so much more an elevated position than licking manuscript stickers that her heart began to pound with joy. A girl could do a lot worse on her second day in the working world. What an exciting feeling to answer the telephone and recognize the name given to her as one of a famous author. She knew most of these only vaguely, as names she had heard somewhere before, but she memorized them all instantly. When Mr. Shalimar went out to lunch at the Algonquin with a Hollywood writer, she closed his door and read everything on his desk. Then she went downstairs to the coffee shop in the building. The coffee shop, which doubled as a bar at night, was brightly lit now and crowded with girls and women who all seemed to be talking at once at the top of their lungs. 6 at a time would be jammed into a booth, hunched over their hamburgers and dissecting the other office personnel with venom or hilarity. 4 or 5 harried waitresses in limp uniforms pushed their way through the crowd with plates lined along their arms from wrist to shoulder. They looked like jugglers. Every seat at the curving counter was occupied, mostly by girls, with 2 or 3 men scattered among them, looking trapped behind their newspapers and greasy platters. April saw one of these men standing up to leave, and she maneuvered her way quickly to his vacant seat, feeling as if she were still on the subway. The counter in front of her, with a grease-spotted, balled-up napkin thrown into the plate, a streak of catsup where she tried to put her elbow, and some change scattered in a puddle of spilled water, made her almost lose her appetite. She turned around and saw that the girl sitting next to her was Caroline Bender. She was wearing a black suit today, and she looked like a model in a fashion magazine. Her dark hair was cut just to her earlobes, turned under sleekly, with a fringe of bangs, and she was wearing blue eyeshadow. April tried to think of something to say to her, glancing at her profile out of the corner of her eye and thinking, how sad she looks. Caroline was staring ahead at the shelf of apple and custard pies and looking right through them. Then she turned her head. "Hi," she said, as if she were really glad to see someone she knew, even though they didn't actually know each other. "I know you. We sit next to each other in the office, and now here," April said. "We should at least introduce ourselves. I'm April." "I'm Caroline." Caroline held out her hand, and they shook hands, each of them laughing a little for no particular reason except perhaps embarrassment and relief. "What do you do?" The waitress cleared away the counter in front of them, looking even more repelled than the customers. She put down 2 gravy-stained menus. "I'm a typist, I guess," April said. "But right now I'm working for Mr. Shalimar as his secretary." "Good for you. Do you want to be an editor eventually?" "Why does everybody ask me that?" April said. "I just took this job because I needed the money, and when I set foot in Mr. Shalimar's office, he gave me the 3rd degree. Is it true there are all these girls battling for my little job?" "That's what I was told at the employment agency. They're all college girls with good educational backgrounds and no experience, and they're willing to work for practically nothing. That's why Fabian can pay so little and get away with it. And $50 is good for our kind of job. Most places start their girls at 40. "Do you want to be an editor?" Caroline smiled. "Everyone asks me that too. I'm working for Miss Farrow temporarily, and she looks at me as if I might turn around any minute and bite her jugular vein, but I think I'm beginning to understand why she does. There's something catching about ambition." The waitress brought their sandwiches, and they ate for a minute or two in silence. "You come from New York, don't you?" April said. "Port Blair, that's about 40 minutes away." "Is that like the country?" "Well, most of the Westchester towns are. In fact, Port Blair is the only one that isn't. You have all the disadvantages of a long train ride, and then when you get there, you have all the disadvantages of a dirty little city. Do you live with your family? That's the only reason for living in a place like Port Blair." "I come from Colorado," April said. "I know." "You know? How do you know?" "Mary Agnes told me." "Oh, she's funny. She knows everything about everybody." April smoothed back her long, tangled hair. "I thought at first you meant you could tell because I look different. New York girls look so sophisticated." "Mary Agnes?" Caroline said, smiling. "Brenda? No, not them. But you do. You're my idea of what a New York girl should look like." "Well, thank you," Caroline said. "I take it that's a compliment?" "Oh, it is," April said. "It is." They paid their checks and rode upstairs together in the elevator. "Are you doing anything tomorrow after work?" Caroline asked her. "I don't think so." "Well, maybe we could have supper together somewhere and go to a movie. Would you want to?" "I'd love it." "Okay, we will then. See you." April went into Mr. Shalimar's empty office, shut the door, kicked off her shoes, and did a pirouette on the soft rug. She was very happy. She took her mirror out of her purse, and with the other hand held her hair off her neck, turning her head this way and that. How come she had never noticed before that she looked like a woolly bear, and there was something queer-looking about her suit. Her mother had always said that girls with blue eyes should wear pale blue, and that black was for funerals and old ladies. Well, she didn't feel a bit funereal. She felt marvelous. And tonight, when Mr. Shalimar gave her supper money, she was going to use it to go to the beauty parlor. And on Friday, when she got paid, she was going to buy a black suit just like Caroline's. Mr. Shalimar wouldn't even recognize her in a couple of days. Her heart began to pound. Wasn't she lucky? She was lucky, all right. She took his ashtray out to the wastebasket in the hall and emptied it and washed it out in the water fountain. It wasn't until she noticed Mary Agnes's shocked face that she realized she had forgotten to put on her shoes. Dark comes quickly in January, and at 5 o'clock, when the girls in the bullpen began to cover their typewriters and tie on their kerchiefs, the sky outside was already black. Mr. Shalimar was dictating the second page of the monthly report, which was to be 10 pages long. He had allowed April to sit on his sofa while he dictated, and she was perched there with her shoes off again and her legs curled under her, putting down his words with rapid, sure strokes. She had always hated shorthand in school, but right now she was so glad she had learned it that she almost enjoyed it. She could see that he was pleased because he never had to pause for her to catch up. Over the sound of his voice, she dimly heard the noises of departure outside, the clicking of high heels, and the called goodbyes. Soon, there was a different sound, the sound of utter quiet. She stood up to get a sharper pencil. "We can stop for a minute," he said. "You must be tired." "Oh, no, I'm not tired. Where are we? Halfway through?" "Almost." "Are you hungry yet?" "No, sir." He bent down and took a bottle of scotch from the bottom drawer of his desk and a nest of small metal cups. He separated 2 of the cups and poured scotch into both of them. Like a little drink? She had never tasted anything stronger than a mixed drink in her life. "I wouldn't want to waste it," she said timidly. He poured half of hers back into the bottle. "Here," he said, holding the rest out to her. Who would ever believe it, she thought. Here she was, so tongue-tied she couldn't think of a thing to say, drinking scotch in the office with the editor-in-chief of Darby Books. This didn't really look like an office. It looked more like the den of a luxurious home, the kind you see in the movies. "Luck," Mr. Shalimar said briskly, and tossed off his drink in one swallow. He poured some water from his carafe and drank it, not even looking at her. Well, maybe they weren't exactly socializing, but she was present, and that was something. She tasted her scotch gingerly and forced down a few sips, feeling the warmth travel down her throat. Mr. Shalimar poured himself another drink and looked at her for the first time. "Want some water in it?" "I guess so." She let him pour water into her cup, looking down at his dark, silver-flecked hair, seeing a mole on his ear and embarrassed to be so close to him. In the moment he was weakening her drink, she noticed every line and tiny mark on his face. At first with curiosity, because he was a great man she knew so little about, and then with a feeling that was a kind of intimacy, because she felt somehow that his wrinkles and birthmarks and imperfections belonged to his private life. But she was just indulging in hero worship, she told herself sensibly, and then she let herself indulge in it. "Thank you," she said, and went back to her seat on the couch. He leaned back in his desk chair and crossed his long legs. His skin was dark, with an athletic club lunch-hour tan, and he wore a wedding ring. He looked a little like a Greek shipping magnate, or some kind of Near East tycoon, she thought. On his desk were silver-framed pictures of his family. "You know," he said, "very few people realize the great future that's waiting for paperback books. Do you realize that we have a first printing of 250,000 copies for each and every book? How many copies do you think the average hardcover book sells?" "I don't know." A couple of thousand copies if it's a flop. Maybe 100,000 copies if it's a bestseller. 100,000 readers in the whole of America. That's not many, is it? No, she said. Do you realize there are towns in America where there are no libraries at all? Not even a bookstore. The only place the people in those small towns can get a book is at the drugstore. And what do they read? Our books, my heavens, she said. We are responsible for the changing literary taste of America, he went on. People have to learn to crawl before they can walk. First, they won't read anything but the most obvious kind of lurid adventure stories. Then we sneak in a good book or two. We train them. Eventually, all our books will be as good or better than the best so-called literary hardcover books. Do you think all hardcover books are good literature just because they cost $4? Most of them stink. She smiled a little at his vehemence and took a few healthy gulps at her drink. It made her feel more confident, and she finished it off. It's our books, with our sexy covers, and our low cost, and our mass distribution that are teaching America how to read. Let people who don't know anything say, Darby books are trash. They'll see. I never thought of it that way, she said. He beckoned for her cup, and she went to his desk and waited while he fixed her another drink. This time, he tapped his cup lightly against hers before he drank. She went back to the couch, feeling suddenly very happy. No wonder everyone around here seemed so curious about her editorial ambitions. It wouldn't be a bad thing to get in on the ground floor of a literary movement. That's what it was. Have you read any of our books? He asked. Oh, a few, yes. He opened his desk drawer and took out 4 books and put them into an envelope. Here, read these this week and let me know what you think of them. I'm interested in a young girl's opinion. Mine? She was incredulous. Use your instinct. I'm not interested in your education. Some of the people who buy our books regularly are college graduates, but most of them aren't. They either like a book or they don't. Just tell me whether you like them or not, and tell me why. All right. She realized when she stood up to get the books that she should not have gulped her second drink so quickly. Everything was rather blurry, and her face felt hot. When she took the envelope of books, his hands brushed hers, and she felt a great daughterly affection for him. He looked at his watch. It's late. You must be starved. Tell you what. We'll go downstairs to the place in the building and grab a bite, and then we'll come back up here and finish the monthly report. Go get your coat. She made her way to her desk, holding on to the door as she went through. Those drinks had been stronger than she thought, and it was late. She didn't want him to notice she was high. He'd think she was a real little hick. Some food and coffee were just what she needed. As she powdered her feverish face, she heard him speaking on the telephone in his office. She could not hear the words, but the tone of his voice was weary and apologetic. He was calling his wife, she was sure, to say he would not be home for dinner. She felt sorry for his wife, who had probably been looking forward all day to being with him again, and she felt rather sorry for him because he had to eat a sandwich in a greasy coffee shop and then come upstairs and dictate for 2 more hours to his secretary. The only one she didn't feel sorry for was herself. Good evening, Mr. Shalimar, the waitress said cozily, as if he were a habitué. There were little tables in the darkened bar section of the coffee shop, and the main part where April had eaten lunch was brightly lighted and closed off. Mr. Shalimar led her to a table in the corner. 2 scotches with water on the side, and 2 steaks, he said. Is that all right, April? Yes, sir, fine. Things weren't so blurry in the dark, and from somewhere near the ceiling, soft music was playing. He was sitting next to her on the leather banquette, and he leaned forward, looking at her closely. You're a very beautiful girl. Do you know that? Thank you, she said, embarrassed. Have a lot of boyfriends? What kind of man do you like? I don't have any boyfriends here in New York, she admitted. I don't know any. Back home I had a lot of dates, I guess. Anyone special? Oh, no. What kind of man appeals to you? What kind of man would you like to marry? She had discussed the question many times with her sorority sisters in the long, intimate conversations girls hold in the night, and she recited her answer surely. An understanding man, someone kind and intelligent. He wouldn't have to be handsome as long as he seemed handsome to me. I guess if you love someone, you think he's good-looking, and if you dislike someone or he's mean to you, you get to hate his looks. A very good answer, he murmured. He tapped his glass to hers. I hope you get him. Me too, she said. She drank her scotch and felt like giggling. You have a devastating smile. When you meet that boy, he won't have a chance. This time, she did giggle. I wish I would meet him. I've never been in love, just crushes on boys. But I knew that wasn't real. I wish I were in love with someone who loved me. And what about fun? He was looking at her more closely. Wouldn't you like to meet someone you could have fun with without necessarily being in love? Yes, she said. She wasn't quite sure what he meant. The words were innocent enough, the wise words of a father to an impatient, romantic daughter, but there was something about the way he said fun that made it seem different and infinitely more mysterious than the kind of fun she'd always had with boys or anyone. I guess so, she said. He looked at her warily. What kind of things do the young boys say to the young girls nowadays? What do they say when they want to? Make love? Say? She said. They don't say anything. They mostly just grab. He laughed. That must be very unpleasant. How understanding he was. It is, she said with relief. I just hate it. How do college boys make love? She was a little embarrassed to be talking about kissing and petting with this man. First of all, she had never discussed sex with any man in her life, certainly not even her father. And secondly, Mr. Shalimar was from a world so removed from her own that she could not imagine how he could possibly be interested in her amateurish little front seat battles. I'm not exactly an authority, she said, smiling. Every girl is an authority about her own life, he said. No wonder you're an editor. You know so much about people. I know about people because I ask. I question. I'm insatiably curious about people, he said. How do you think I know what every woman in America wants to read? Because I talk to women, find out what their secret dreams are, what they fear. She felt reassured. The waitress came with the steaks then, and April discovered she was very hungry. She began to devour hers and was halfway through before she discovered that Mr. Shalimar had not taken a bite of his. My goodness, she said, feeling rather concerned about his welfare. Don't let that go to waste. He took a small piece of his steak and pushed the rest around the plate with his fork, looking bemused. She supposed he was used to much fancier cooking than this. As for herself, she thought the steak was marvelous. You may have mine, too, he said. Oh, I couldn't. Go ahead. He placed his steak carefully on her plate, and she smiled at him, feeling self-conscious and childlike and well-cherished. My father used to do that, she said. I imagine you were his favorite. No, it's not that. It's just that my sisters were a lot older than me, and they were sort of settled in their own lives when I was only in high school. So I guess my father had more time to give to me. And also, I think parents get mellower with their youngest children. Mm-hmm, he said. I imagine your father was very protective with you about boys. Well, I didn't confide in him, if that's what you mean. He raised an eyebrow. Ah, you had secrets? Not really. Tell me, what kinds of things do the young boys do when they make love? You want me to tell you? Of course. She could feel her face getting hot. It wasn't that she had any interesting confessions or that she felt guilty. It was simply that one didn't discuss these things with an older man, especially an employer. It wasn't as if he were her family doctor or something, although even her family doctor never talked to her about making love. "Oh, she said vaguely, hoping her answer would satisfy him. "They do the same old things." "Sounds rather boring," he said with a touch of amusement in his voice. "Oh, it is," she said, grateful to see the discussion coming to a close. "It's very boring." He covered her hand with his for an instant and gave it a fatherly pat. "Waitress, check, please." There was only one elevator on night duty, and as they waited for it to come to take them back upstairs, neither of them spoke. She was glad the stakes had sobered her. Now she would be able to take good shorthand and not make mistakes. It was almost impossible to decipher what you'd written the day before if you were sloppy. They could probably finish the report in another hour, she was thinking, and she trailed him into his office, glancing at the wall clock in the bullpen on the way. It seemed funny to see the office clock read 10 o'clock and know it was 10 o'clock at night instead of in the morning. He had left the desk lamp on, and the office was soft with shadows. What a nice living room it would be if the desk were not there. Through the half-open slats of the Venetian blinds, she could see the great, mysterious evening city. New York, city of excitement, of promise, gathering place of all the unknown, vibrant people she hoped someday to meet, who were at this very moment spending planned and unplanned evenings in ways that seemed so much a part of that sophisticated, gay unknown out there and so remote from everything she was used to. She leaned against the desk, moved and speechless, looking out at Mecca. "What are you thinking?" Mr. Shalimar asked, behind her. "I can't say," she breathed. "I wouldn't know how to say it." He came up to her so quickly, she had more a sense of movement than any warning and took her into his arms. His arms were like straps around her so that she could hardly breathe, and his mouth covered hers, hot and violent and authoritative. As soon as the first instant of numb incredulity shattered, she was filled with terror. She twisted her head from side to side, trying to escape the lips and teeth that were trying to devour her, and gave a choked little cry. He let her go. "Mr. Shalimar," she said, and it sounded so stupid in the quiet room and so much a line from one of Fabian's own worst magazines that she started to cry. He stood there looking at her, smiling, not particularly angry, but just amused. He handed her his handkerchief, smelling of lavender. "It's not as bad as all that," he said, smiling. She wiped her eyes and mouth, the mouth quickly so he would not notice, and handed the handkerchief back. She was too embarrassed to flounce off in a huff, and she tried to think of something to say to him, but her mind was completely blank with shock. An old man, at least 50, a married man, right in front of his wife's picture on the desk. He shook his head as one would to a child, wiped his mouth quite carefully, looked at the lipstick on his clean handkerchief, folded it, and placed it neatly in his breast pocket. "Come on," he said. "I'll put you in a taxi." She kept a foot away from him all the way down the hall and descending in the elevator, and when they were finally on the street, he hailed a taxi and held the door open for her. She climbed in as quickly as she could and, with her hand on the inner handle, said, "Good night." "Wait," he said. He handed her $2 bills, crumpled together. "For the fare. I hope you don't live in the Bronx." She shook her head. "Take it." He pressed the money into her hand, and she shrank from his touch. "Your books," he said. He had carried the envelope with the 4 paperback novels in it all the way down in the elevator, and she had not noticed because she had deliberately been avoiding looking at him. "Don't forget to read them," he said pleasantly. He tipped his hat and shut the taxi door. It took her a moment to remember her own address. The inside of the private, dark taxi was comforting. She pushed the envelope of books to the far side of the seat as if it were a dead animal and put her face in her hands. Funny. She did not feel like crying again. She did not even feel like shrinking away from the memory of the forbidden, unexpected kiss that had so frightened her. As a matter of fact, now that she was alone and safe, the feeling of the kiss returned, at first frightening, and then vaguely thrilling and wonderful. Mr. Shalimar had kissed her. Mr. Shalimar. She should feel resentful, she knew. She should feel angered. But she felt instead the stirring of a new feeling, a kind of romantic intoxication. It warmed her, secretly and a little guiltily now that she had embraced it, all the way home.